Hey everyone, welcome back to the Hybrid Friends. Today with my friend Ben from NetCompany. I now noticed that our recording is saying Terry, you're Ben, so I mixed up my recordings, but happens from time to time, so there will be a Terry sooner or later. But I'm here with Ben, and Ben is from NetCompany. And before we introduce the topic, Ben, just give us a short introduction about yourself and NetCompany.
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Flo. NetCompany's originated out of Denmark. It grew massively in Denmark due to the digitization of government services in Denmark. And now we've spread across Europe and Asia. It's about 6,500 people. And we do work in both in the private and public sector. And we have a number of platforms behind the scenes as well, which customers can use. So we've just been doing some digitization work with Copenhagen Airport, for example, and that's based on one of our platforms called Pulse.
Amazing. And the topic we want to talk about, and the point where impressed me on one of our projects, is that you put a lot of effort into finding the break-even point for being on public clouds like Azure or AWS versus using private like Azure Stack, Nutanix, and we went into all those rabbit holes of total cost of ownerships, trainings, backup, etc., and came up with a really amazing summary plus the knowledge around the whole calculation thing.
Yeah, so I work predominantly in the strategy space, so I'm not a deep technical person, and so I enjoy going to channels like yours and understanding better how all these technical pieces fit together. But most of the clients that I'm working with at the moment are very concerned about costs, right? And so total cost of ownership is always at the top of the agenda. And, cost is one of the things that actually cloud was always supposed to help us on. So if we just have a look at the first slide and look at the back to benefits, back to basics. So these are the typical problems that cloud was supposed to fix for us. And public cloud, with the hyperscalers, has fixed many of these, especially when we get into replatforming for FAS and PaaS. But actually what we see sometimes is that it's not always, you can't always replatform these applications and get those cost benefits. So if we go on to the next slide, when you aren't replatforming, then you end up just using the IaaS services. And actually at that point, the cost angle doesn't really work out. Right? Most of our clients are having this pressure to do more with less. And if we go on to the next slide. And our clients aren't alone. So when we start looking across the sector, and we'll give some links to some of the where these quotes are coming from, where these stats are coming from at the bottom in the video, in the chat, we see that 60% say cost effectiveness was a driver to get to cloud. And this, we see these customers who want this agile, secure, and easy to use cloud solution, but they're still very concerned about the costs. And in fact, 82% then say the cloud spending is still a number one priority, and 72% have got a FinOps operation already, and 72% have a hybrid cloud, and 46% are actually using Azure Stack. So what we see there is Azure Stack is a leader, according to Flexera report.
Yeah. It's also on the, I think yesterday there was a new Gartner quadrant, and
oh right.
Yeah, and there was Microsoft and VMware on the top right. So we're more or less battling now with VMware on the market. But it's yep. As you said, it's one of the most common and also rising providers. It's also one thing our product group sees, and we're getting more and more requests for Azure Stack HCI special, and just waiting for the Ignite announcements here. There's more.
Right, it's all coming. It's all coming.
Yeah, I'm on the same page like you here.
So actually, when we do these cloud migrations for companies, then what we actually see is some apps don't migrate well, and some of them have specific problems and sometimes they need to be repatriated back. And in fact, in a report, 46% have repatriated something. Doesn't mean they repatriated an awful lot, but it does mean they repatriated something. And cost, lack of fit to the platform, and also specialisms drive that need to sometimes repatriate. When we look at the hyperscalers and we consider how they, like Microsoft, and we consider how they make best value out of their hardware, there's some great videos around of how Microsoft manage their data centers, and it's really interesting to watch those. Azure are now refreshing every 6 years, and actually, if we look at the market as a whole, 50% are refreshing at 5 years or more already. But what's really interesting is from lots of the hardware vendors for the Azure Stack HCI is you can get a 7-year warranty. And that allows you to really use what one of my favorite phrases is, which is to sweat the asset. Right? So you've invested in these pieces of hardware, get the best value out of them by just paying for a little bit extra, a few years extra warranty. And they're almost paid for themselves by that point. And actually, whilst cloud prices haven't really moved too much, maybe even gone up a little bit in some places, what we have seen is that hardware prices have continued to drop.
Especially after pandemic, lot of the prices dropped back to being very expensive, unavailable to, let's say, pre-pandemic normal state. And also with the battle between AMD Intel coming or being in place in the server market, those became a bit more competitive to each other and not going overpriced on the CPUs, memory, etc.
So when we actually looked at an example of around 300 VMs, we did some desktop research, and we used the Azure calculator and we used the Azure Stack calculator, and to create these figures. Now, some caveats, because this was for 300 VMs running just one COTS product, by the way. So it's a significantly sized application. And it was very core heavy, which may influence where some of these figures, where the actual crossover point is. And it was all based on list pricing, so no specialist discounts were taken into account from the hardware providers or from Microsoft themselves. So we're balancing that out. But we did use things like reserved instances in Azure. So it's always really important to run your own calculations on your own VMs. They are amazingly simple to use, these calculators that have been provided. And again, we'll include the links to in the chat to the video. So when we look at that, we see straight away that actually 1 year in this particular example, we could actually host, we were getting a return on investment in 1 year of actually buying that hardware. So it's basically cheaper year one to buy the hardware, install it, and run it than it was to run it as a set of VMs in Azure. And as we can see, as we move across to the right, we start to see that year 7, we see an uplift in that Azure Stack HCI total cost of ownership as we do a hardware refresh. And you can see it's going up very moderately, and that's just because of the electricity costs, which we included.
That's maybe one thing we need to mention, because you did that, I think, based on the UK prices for energy. Absolutely. And it could be a huge difference when you're living like me in Germany with now very high energy prices, or France or Italy, or if you're living in the Nordics, it may be cheaper than even in the UK. So that's, if someone wants to
that's a really good point. Different regional variations are on your and also on what data centers are available, because you'll get different power efficiency ratios in different data centers. If you're running your own on premise, you may not be getting, a great power efficiency ratio. So that includes the cooling and the other parts of running the data center. Again, it depends on the local market you're in as to how these figures will come out. The other thing that clients are quite interested in, certainly in the UK, is now social value. And so one of the things that I've included on there is actually the carbon costs. Unfortunately, I'm not able at this point to actually give there is a carbon cost calculator for Azure, but you actually, as I understand it, have to have access to the Azure tenant to be able to run that. So what I've done there is shown, actually, it's, again, the actual cost, the carbon cost of the electricity is minor compared to the uplift of actually by the carbon in the creation of the hardware assets. So again, by sweating that cycle from, say, 5 years to 7 years, we're reducing the amount of carbon required to run that system significantly.
And especially when you look on the hardware swap period, you would then, for example, not drop your systems away. You maybe extend to 7 years and then use it for another purpose. So I have customers who say,
yes.
okay, I have these new core heavy or memory heavy applications. I will buy a new cluster for those, but the less SLA heavy applications like domain controllers, maybe some web servers, they will stay on the old cluster. I will use it then for testing purpose again, so repurpose the cluster for something else and put the heavier workloads, the high availability workloads on the newer cluster I purchased. So you have another 2 years where you can, let's say, reuse your old investment, which makes it then again very
absolutely. So reusing the carbon footprint by repurposing that hardware is great in what's termed circularity. In that cradle to cradle is often the thing which is quoted about now in carbon accountancy.
And another thing which reduces the overall carbon is if you're co-locating somewhere, like with Interaction, Equinix, they now build
absolutely
low carbon or zero carbon data centers. So if you're co-locating into those, like Microsoft is doing, like AWS is doing, like Google, you also reduce your carbon footprint by co-locationing, and they do not need to take care of the environmental influences because those co-location providers will offer you those it's a carbon neutrality with their facility. So it's maybe one thing you, as a customer, you also need to take in account if you're renting, if you're going into a data center, is what's the carbon efficiency or the ecosystem friendliness of those data centers, not moving into the old, maybe cheaper ones, but on the long term, on the carbon efficiency and maybe certificates you need to buy for your environment for your next certification, etc. It may be more efficient to look onto those co-location providers.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to mention here is when you're doing these comparisons, is it's important to think about what Azure benefits, what Azure gives you in terms of availability, and making sure that when you're calculating your total cost of ownership, that you have the same level of benefits. So, for example, in this instance, we were configuring it for N+1 availability. So you weren't going to have to take, if you had to patch servers, for example, you weren't going to have to take the application down. And also that we could run it over 2 data halls, right, as a stretched cluster. So you've got like a zone 1 and a zone 2 in UK South, for example. You've got that equivalence. It's important to have equivalence in all these things, because otherwise you'll get caught up later on with a big bill.
And again, it's also important to plan your application for that availability. So if you want to have different zones like Azure has, you need to have maybe a second cluster. You maybe need to build your Kubernetes application or overall availability of the applications to run on 2 separate sets of clusters.
Yeah. So I was just going to give you a bit of a background on the original hardware setup for this, because it wasn't actually hyper-converged. And so actually what we see when we look at the original hardware for this application, it had SAN storage and all the rest, and it actually was spread across quite a lot of different locations. So obviously by consolidating it into two halls, we got a lot better, a reduced footprint, just 5 servers. But actually there was 9 times the amount of hardware involved in that original solution, right? Just in terms of pieces of hardware. And the savings per year in electricity were in the hundreds of thousands, right? Just from moving it to central location, reducing that hardware count. But as you can imagine, again, from a carbon accountancy point of view, there's a huge amount of carbon sunk into into that much larger footprint of hardware. So actually, if we look at the original solution, which was hosting these 300 VMs, it wasn't a hyper-converged solution. It was virtualized, but it had SAN storage and comprised of a lot more parts. In fact, there was 9 times the number of components compared to the 5 servers that we actually need for this solution. And in terms of electricity savings, there was savings in excess of £100,000 a year just through migrating to 5 pieces of hardware. And obviously, with all those different pieces of hardware, it's much more complex to manage and operate. So there's significant savings moving off that old environment to a new hyper-converged solution like Azure Stack HCI.
Even with the learning curve you have at the start? So
yeah, I mean, so for these clients, they've already started to exploit Azure. So they already have an operating model. And this is the great thing about Azure Stack HCI, is it builds on that existing operating model. So rather than having 2 separate ways of doing things, we end up with one way, which is the Azure way. The fact that underneath it's built on on-premise hardware is a secondary piece to worry about. Okay. And if we think about from an operating model point of view, who makes a decision about where the right place to host that? Maybe we need to think about what team does that. And as we saw in the survey, a lot of people already have a FinOps team. If that FinOps team understand which workloads are suitable for hosting on-prem and which can be in the cloud, and you have architectural understanding about how to make sure workloads are location independent, so they could be hosted on-prem or in the cloud, then the FinOps team can be made accountable for making sure the total cost of ownership of running your applications is low. And they can have the authority to expand the on-premise environment and to bring workloads back from the cloud and run them on the on-premise hardware. And this way, you've got somebody who is effectively doing that piece of work of making and providing a service which smooths out the decision making of, oh, where do I put this? Do I have to do lots of complicated calculations? Well, no, the FinOps team can see what the costs are, and they can make it optimal for the business.
Okay, understood.
So, with the private cloud, because you can sweat the assets, you're getting that cost effectiveness, but we're not getting the benefits of that faster deployment, ease of scalability, disaster recovery, competitive edge and innovation. All that speed and flexibility is gone from private cloud. But obviously with hybrid cloud, that's when you start to get the benefits of the hyperscaler environment with its ultimate flexibility and the on-premise environment giving that cost effectiveness. And with Azure Stack HCI in particular, what we're getting also is that single operating model, which means that everything is it's very easy to use things like the data and security tools like Sentinel. It's very easy to use your environment build tools, and it's very easy to scale out and in Azure and give you that competitive edge and innovation. And of course, you can have your on-premise environment as your prime environment and just DR to Azure, because you can run those workloads there, which may mean you don't have to run two data centers or data center services.
And also, if you say accessibility, so with the new admin center integration into Arc, you can also manage your clusters directly from Azure, so you can do it from everywhere if you like, without being on the location, and also integration with the.
Absolutely. That's the key thing. It's having that single pane of glass, right, for operations. There's one place to go and do your operations, and that's Portal, right? You've got one scripting tool. You know, everything's in one place, right? Security operations, they can see everything, regardless of if it's on-prem or whether it's in Azure. Your service management team, they see all the data, you know, regardless of whether it's on-prem or it's actually in the Azure environment. It's all done with single panes of glass.
Yeah. And especially when we're looking on a wider edge environment, like with retailers. So I recently worked a lot with retailers, where you see a few hundred of clusters being out there.
Yes,
maybe
out in the shops, yes.
Yeah, maybe small 1-2 node clusters, but you have all these fleets running out there. And that's what I know from my colleagues in the product group, is they see more and more of those edge clusters coming up. Not much of data centers, so not large HCI clusters or large hyperconverged. There's still a more classic approach, but they see more and more highly condensed edge environments. And especially what Microsoft is doing is highly investing into fleet management, fleet updating, keeping your fleet alive, more or less. And also with the premier solutions from Dell and Lenovo, which were recently announced, it's all these proactive services, so that you as a customer, you get a pop-up, okay, there's a disk failure or there's a failure with my cluster, that you get more proactive help. So Dell is calling you and say, hey, in location Amsterdam on shop 24, there's a disk failure. Can we send someone to replace it?
Yes.
And it's more of these, especially in the hybrid space, where you can leverage the cloud capabilities to help you.
Yes.
And also then partner services to reduce your overall amount of management costs, sending someone with the disk on site to replace, or as I said, with the recovery of workloads, you can just get it back from Azure as soon as your cluster is back online. And
yes, it's that piece about the service management. You know, effectively, you want that private cloud of your part of your hybrid cloud to be as good as the Azure environment. You don't have to worry in Azure about the disk fails, right? It's all managed for you. And you aim to have that same operating model effectiveness in your private cloud part of your hybrid. And so it's important to get the right services in place from your hardware provider, call out, etc., so that when something does go, they're automatically ticketed, they come out, they fix it. And from your staff's point of view, the private cloud part is a lights out facility. Nobody ever has to go there. Nobody ever has to touch anything once it's set up and installed. It's only when you go and do a refresh that you need to think about, what are we putting in the rack, etc. So that's the service management part is extremely important, so that we get that optimized operating model.
And you also get, what you also can get in addition is these pay as, especially with HPE, GreenLake, Lenovo TrueScale, and Dell Apex, you get these pay as you use approach, pay for capacity approach.
Yes, of course. And that's quite interesting. And some companies, how you get into the whole accountancy rules around this, about whether it's CapEx, OpEx. Some companies, don't want CapEx on their books, and they'll want to pay OpEx. So maybe something like GreenLake or the equivalent from other providers is a good deal. Other companies will maybe want to CapEx things. And other companies where it might be that GreenLake might be treated as an OPEX expense. Other companies might treat it as a CapEx expense because the accountancy rules around these things are quite complicated.
Yeah. That's said with those providers are moving into more hybrid approaches. They offer more of those services, which makes it again much more efficient for customers when running on-prem. And as you said, there are companies and partners who cannot move all assets to the cloud. Or I see that with my friends in the US, they're more cloud heavy because they have all those data centers spread around the whole continent, more or less. But when you look into Europe, we're small countries, and maybe not every country has its own data center, either from AWS, Google, Microsoft, whatsoever. And then you have your machinery controls, etc., where you need to stay near a data center, and then you want to
Absolutely.
a management approach, but you want to have it near of the production machinery you want to control with. And
so data jurisdiction is always an interesting case in Europe, where we've got lots of countries where the data can't leave, and so those instances begin private cloud. The private cloud part becomes of more interest.
That's not even within Europe. I'm working a lot with China, India, Japan, where we have the same data privacy policies in place, especially when in China it's the case if IP is produced in China. So if you have a developer developing a feature or product in China, it needs to stay in China. You can replicate or you can store backups outside of China, but the main product needs to stay in China. So there's not much of public cloud in China. So we need to have some kind of hybrid solution which can communicate to any public cloud through Hong Kong maybe, but data can then still reside in your on-prem research location to feed those privacy laws. The same in India and Japan, where we have more or less the same regulations in place. Still a lot of things we didn't cover. Is there anything you want to add, or where you say a glass? Maybe some scenario for the future.
Yeah. So one of the things is, you talked about GreenLake and things like that, because they actually have a curve more like the Azure curve. Because as I understand it, and I've not got into this great deal, effectively what you do is you get an amount of tin on site, right? Yeah. And then you're paying by use. So the curve is then more like the Azure curve, although it could be flatter. I haven't actually done any cost modeling on that myself. So I'd be interested if anybody has, because that would be, because I'm sure you pay.
Request for someone from HPE talking here? If yes,
I think it'd be great to see how the cost modeling works and understand how that works with things like GreenLake and its Apex from Dell, isn't it, and other providers, obviously, because I think we'd see that curve being more like the Azure curve. It'd be interesting to see whether it crosses over the Azure curve or whether it's actually still below, and whether that, whether the cost savings really are there or not. I just don't have the data, unfortunately, to be able to make a judgment on that at the moment.
That's something
so I think that'd be really interesting
on the channel. That's not the biggest issue. Just need to reach out to someone from HPE. But you have sometimes those customers. I worked a lot with production companies when I worked at Dell, and they were, I think it was Hugo Cabret they produced at that time. And they said they only need to have a few hundreds of servers with GPUs in, because there's a heavy session for 6 months to render those final cuts. So they were running 24/7 on a few hundred servers to render those final sessions or those final cuts. And for customers just needing things over a short period of time, those rental models are perfect, like we had with Azure Stack HCI. And then you just send it back. But as you said, customers who want to use or want to use their hardware for the full lifespan, those models are maybe not the perfect because it's more Azure-like on-prem, but it's perfect again for those customers who want to run on OpEx costs, like startups. We don't know if startups will fly, so their investors don't want to see a lot of capex costs on the builds. They want to see more OpEx to shut the startup down as soon as they see it's not profitable.
So in my experience, I've been involved in startups previously, and one of the things they've been concerned about is actually having capex sitting on the books, because actually when you come to sell an organization or you try and value it, what's sitting on the books from a capex point of view can affect that valuation. So they'd rather see OpEx costs, right? And higher OpEx costs than they would a capex. And like you say, some people just go, you know what, we have an own nothing culture, right? We just rent everything. We don't buy anything. We don't rent our building. We don't buy our buildings. We don't buy our hardware. We don't buy our cars. We don't buy our trucks. We just rent everything, right? And then you can, as your business grows and falls, you can flex with it. And again, so as you pointed out, there's the ability to flex is what's key in the cloud. The ability to just scale up massively and then decrease. You have peak processing, annual peak processing. You have like you say, big render jobs to be done, but there's still an awful lot of workloads out there which don't require that, and that's where Azure Stack HCI and technologies like that come into play.
Yeah. And we saw that heavily during the pandemic. So we had customers owning their hardware, but then running out of. I worked a lot with universities, for example, at that time.
Oh, did you? Right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I've done a lot of university. I've done a lot of university.
Yeah, and also with a lot of financial institutes who said normally we would be fine with running in our data centers because we only had a few remote users. But now we have those two worlds, or we have these more remote world, especially also for the students who often then went back to their own countries to be with their families during those hard times. And they said, okay, now we have a lot of remote students. Yes, we would be able to cover that from our own data centers, but the issue is they are now no longer sitting in the UK. They are now in India. They are in the US, especially US, as people going to UK or France or Germany because it's much cheaper to study here than in the US itself. And they said, okay, now they are sitting over. What should we do? The latency is just too long. They cannot work with our environments here. So that's the local students can get everything we have locally, or from the financial institute. They said, okay, what the users who need to work on an on-prem, our own data center environment due to regulations, they will now use our on-prem, and the others scale out. They scale to the cloud, and we again have the same single pane of glass. And that gave a huge push to AVD, that gave a huge push to Arc at the time, because that's the operation model behind those environments, behind those servers. Scale wherever you need and still have it manageable from those single pane of glass. And I don't want to point a good or bad out there. It's really the use case you need to look at. It's not everything is perfect and cheaper in cloud or on-prem. It's just how your business, how your combination looks like. How do you want to scale out? So best of both worlds, basically, is as is shown here, the hybrid approach.
So is there anything else you want to cover, or do you want to have a look through the video and then get?
So Ben, if anything top of mind, otherwise I would say we covered a lot today. And if there's more or someone, we already identified we should do something with HPE, Dell, or Lenovo on their pay-as-you-use models, comparatively than how it works. And otherwise, I would say let's close the session. Thank you so much. And everyone who wants to know more about what Ben and NetCompany did, just use the comments. I can put you in contact. Otherwise, feedback, as you know, use the comments, subscribe our channel. Best famous words to you. Any quotes you want to make for the future?
No, I do think it's time to love your data center again, and I think it's time to exploit that hybrid cloud opportunity with the combined operating model.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and being with me. And I think we will find another topic we can talk about.
Yes, that'd be
There's
great.
enough out there. We should do a project again together somewhere in the future, and I think we will then find perfect new opportunity.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.